and really some fascinating collaboration there to really expand on all of this. Let's bring in our esteemed panel this morning. Today's discussion is called Āina Momona. If you have any questions to our viewers out there for our panelists, please feel free to send them in at this time right through the Q&A feature on your Zoom program. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible during the time that we have. If we don't get to all of them, we'll be posting them on the conference website along with the conference videos and panel discussions. All right, leading our discussion this morning, honored to welcome Assistant Professor of Natural Resources and Environmental Management, Melissa Price from the College of Tropical Agriculture and Human Resources right here at UH Mānoa. Melissa will introduce the panelists joining us today. And Melissa, aloha to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Aloha kako. Thank you for having me this morning. We're going to begin with an oli by Dr. Mehanovan.
Ano ai me ke aloha ya oko pakahi apau. Mahalo for joining us this morning. We invite you wherever you are to take a moment to stand up. We begin by honoring all of the places that we work and all of the ancestors before us in taking care of those places. This is an oli written by students to guide our work and research at the University of Hawaiʻi. And it asks that our work bring thriving and abundance to everything that lives, mountain to sea. So many of you know it. If you do, wherever you are, feel free to join in. E aloha no ka āina uluwehi, ehi ke aloha o nā kupunai. E puna vai ke kau I ka hano, hano wale o Hawaiʻi. E ho mai ka mau popopono, ono mai ukahi aloha, aloha, aloha. Mahalo.
Mahalo, Mehana. So we'll start with introducing our panel today. These are people that I'm absolutely excited to have the privilege of working with and to observing the work that they do. And I'm so excited that they get to share with you today. So we'll begin with Dr. Rosie Allegado.
Aloha mai kako. I study organisms you can't see with your eyes, microbes, which are foundational for all life on Earth. The way that I approach science and practice science is shaped by my lived experiences. Next, please. Noho'au, makaili āina o ahui manu I ke Ahupua'a o ka halu'u, o pu'u ma eli ku'upu'u, o ka ua po'ai hale ku'uwai. My work is Āina-oriented and instrument-based. Next slide, please. My group has partnered with Paipai'ohe'eia, the indigenous stewards of an 800-year-old fish pond, which happens to be right next to my pu'u, to understand how bioculture orientation and disturbance affect the functioning of the fish pond. Through this work, next please, I helped co-develop a process for developing equitable partnerships between researchers and community called Kulana Noi'i. Next slide, please. I'm absolutely committed to nurturing our local students, and I'm also the director of the Miley Mentoring Bridge program within the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology. And this program helps students transition from our community colleges to Mānoa, and particularly to specialize in the geosciences. Mahalo.
Mahalo, Dr. Allegado. And Kapua Kawelo will introduce herself next.
Aloha, everyone. My name is Kapua Kawelo. My ohana is from Ka'alaia and Pakole, Oahu on the windward side. I currently reside in Kahalu'u, though. I grew up diving and hiking and learning cultural practice from my ohana. So very much what I do is rooted in that practice. I am the Natural Resources Program Manager for the U.S. Army Garrison, Hawaii. We work to balance we work to balance protection of native plants and animals and habitats with ongoing Army training. This work is driven by the Endangered Species Act. On Army lands on Oahu, there are on Oahu and Ahupua'a on Hawaii, there are over 100 endangered plants and animals and a diversity of native ecosystems. I have been engaged in this hana for 25 years, and I'm privileged to know these Hawaiian species intimately and be able to visit these special places that support them. I'm happy to be here today and look forward to a productive discussion. Mahalo.
Mahalo. And next we have Dr. Christopher Sabine.
Aloha, and mahalo for including me in this wonderful discussion that we're going to have today. I really appreciate it. You saw most of my interests and work from the video that was shown previously, but for this discussion, I just wanted to add that as a scientist, a climate scientist that's looking at how our planet and ecosystems are evolving over time, I think it's critically important that we understand where we come from, and including indigenous knowledge and traditional understanding of the environment is a critical piece of that and helps us to better understand where we are today and where we're going into the future. And I really look forward to having additional discussions with all of you about how we can marry our modern and current scientific and technological approaches with traditional knowledge and traditional approaches to better understand our environment. Thank you.
All right, and next we have Dr. Mehanovan.
Alo mai kako e na hulu mamolike ole o wau Mehanovan he kama no Kalihiwai, Kauai. I come from Kalihiwai on the island of Kauai. I'm grateful to be raising my 3 children here with my husband in the same community. My work focuses on kaiaulu, on community, and how communities across Hawaii are taking care of the places that nourish them. In this picture, a lot of my work has been focused with elders and kupuna on understanding for my own home community what are the responsibilities or kuleana that come with being from a place, and how do people take care of places. And I find increasingly in my work in extension programs, we are growing kupuna. This is our pictures from our summer program. This summer, working with local keiki in schools, as well as in our community, and working with communities across Hawaii that are engaged in caring for and making decisions about their land and sea. These communities are increasingly connected in kipuka of kuleana, connected across the world, across Hawaii. And then I just feel so grateful to teach both in communities across Hawaii, community leaders, as well as students at the University of Hawaii, all of whom are future resource managers of this place. So aloha, mahalo, I'm so excited to be here with everyone today.
Mahalo. And next we have Sharon Ziegler-Chang.
There I am. Aloha mai kako. I am Sharon Ziegler-Chong. I grew up in the rural Midwest in a family of farmers and educators. And I've been blessed to be here in Hawaii for over 30 years now, raising my family and working with different groups on conservation and community efforts. I'm a biologist by training, but I'm really a people person. For anybody who knows and works with me, that's what I enjoy. My passions are really developing the next generation of Āina leaders and stewards, as well as connecting people. That's my joy of connecting with people from different backgrounds, different networks together, so that we can work together on these really important efforts with our island resources. I've worked at UH since 1992. I helped start and have coordinated the Pacific internship programs for Exploring Science, or PIPES, since 1994, and that'll come up in my conversations probably as we talk along. And I work with students, colleagues, faculty, more former interns, and many partners across the islands and into the Pacific to build and strengthen collaborative conservation efforts through my role here at Hilo as Director of Research and Community Partnerships. I'm really honored to be a part of this group. It's a stellar group, and I look forward to the conversation.
Mahalo. So we have our esteemed panel today. My name is Melissa Price. As mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Management. And my focus is conservation and wildlife management. And for me, there are some mornings that I wake up and I feel fairly overwhelmed by the problems that we're facing. As climate change impacts our forest birds through avian malaria, we're watching for a handful of species right now, we're facing the potential very real possibility of extinction. And so some days those problems seem very overwhelming. It is through talking with and working with people such as those on our panel today that I gain hope and that I gain a lot of energy for diving back in and saying, well, what is the thing that I can do today? How can I contribute to this? And I hope that as each of you listen to this panel today, share your questions with them and find out things from them, that you will also gain hope and energy and be renewed in your desire to positively impact the world around you. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm so glad you can be here. I wanted to start with perhaps Kapua, if you would go first and just talk with us a little bit about what are the grand challenges that your work addresses?
Oh, that's a hard one. Yeah, I mean, I have the privilege of working with so many amazing plants and animals native to Hawaii. We've had great successes through the years in bringing endangered plants and some animals back from the brink of extinction. But in all that work, it's a continual progression from successes to new challenges. We're always looking sort of around the bend at what's coming down the pipe. So I would say that the grand challenges are that the unknown of what's going to be next. So I think climate change is obviously one big contributor to that unknown, that uncertainty. But also the lack of adequate biosecurity in our state. I think rapid Ahupua'a death, the pathogen that causes that. We had, I talked to Dr. Lloyd Loop some years ago, and he said that we had 5 other pests of Ahupua'a come, and we just missed, we just got lucky. We just missed it in all those other times. So it took us 6 times to get something that was like, had us open our eyes. And we're still not doing enough. I look to places like New Zealand, I mean, the lengths that they go to protect their resources, because they are their economy, and they value the perpetuation, and they understand that they're limited, there's a limitation on them. So I think we need to adopt much more biosecurity comparable to New Zealand, because Hawaii's natural resources are what makes Hawaii this tourist destination and is our economic driver for the state. So that's what I would put at my top. Mahalo.
I'm wondering if we can move from Mauka to Makai. And Mehana, I know that your work, while not entirely focused on oceans, a lot of the major progress in your work that I've seen has been in the area of oceans. Can you speak to some of the grand challenges that your work addresses?
Sure. I want to thank Kapua, because I think the places she's caring for are such sources of nourishment. I got to go with some friends this year and hike, and the joy, I'm a lay maker, and the joy when you're with practitioners hula people for whom those plants are really friends, and to see them thriving when we don't see them thriving in our own places in the same way is such a nourishment and so vital. And I think our oceans are similarly challenged. Climate change for our community is very real. We had a whole community cut off by a landslide for 6 months this year. In 2018, 10 landslides cut off some of the same communities for over a year. So for us, because we are ocean communities and the sea is rising and the earth is falling, our mountains are falling as the oldest geological island of the main islands, Kauai, we're really caught in a small band of areas to live. Combined with that is the challenge of tourism. And with tourism, unfortunately, people don't just visit, but increasingly they buy land in Hawaii, they invest in Hawaii, and that's incredibly displacing. So while my community has really been a leader in these community-based subsistence fishing areas, where the reef and the ocean is cared for as it has been traditionally, and with sustainable fishing practices to ensure fish for next generations, that kind of work isn't possible if communities cannot stay in their place. So I'm really encouraged because there is so much Indigenous ecological knowledge and Indigenous technologies, and communities have lived and adapted in these places for generations and are continuing to. Our community was amazing during the floods, things like networks of checking on elders, networks of food distribution, as well as approaches for caring for waterways that really kept people safe. But those things can't happen if the people of a place aren't there and aren't able to stay in place. So increasingly we're working on issues of land access and how to help local families hold on to their lands in these communities.
Hello. So for those of you present today, as you listen, I know sometimes speaking with people who are on the front lines of this work can be a little shocking when you talk with people who actually see, you know, and have worked for 30 years, 40 years on the front lines. They've seen the declines of species. They've seen the changes, the emerging diseases, the changes as sea level rise occurs. And so sometimes it can be a little overwhelming to have these conversations. What I want you to listen for today is not just the grand challenges and the reality of what we are facing, but also the hope that they bring to it, the ways that they show up every day, and the ways that you can join in helping to solve these problems. I want to turn to Rosie. And Rosie, if you wouldn't mind speaking to two things. One, multiple ways of knowing. And I know sometimes we speak in ways that imply a dichotomy between culture and science. And this was addressed briefly yesterday, but I was wondering if you can set the tone for today in our conversation in talking about appropriate ways of framing that just a little bit more.
Yes, thanks so much, Melissa, for asking me that question. Yeah, I think when we even look at the title of this conference, we need to think more deeply about it. We need to interrogate the words that we choose. Words are very important because they frame the mindset with which we approach things. So, you know, even the word blending, and I kind of brought this up a little bit in kind of raising a question to the speakers yesterday on yesterday's panel. I particularly was really taken and appreciated the thoughts that Alan Tokunaga and Ka'u Kimura and the panelists yesterday talked about, and recognizing that when you use the word blending, let's just start with the word blending first of all. Blending implies that it's all mixed up, and then it's like, you know, you cannot these elements are no longer discernible, independently discernible. So when we begin to think about blending, as opposed to maybe interweaving, then we can when we interweave as opposed to blend also kind of connotes the idea of assimilation, meaning that which blends together is no longer recognizable from that which went in. So the other thing is, I think we're doing a lot of shorthand signaling, perhaps. You know, the title, the next couple words of this conference was blending culture and science. And I think there's some important missing adjectives there. I think what they meant to say was blending Hawaiian culture with Western science. And I think that that setting that up is also, you know, pretty superficial, because I think that it's really important to see that all science is cast within, you know, a cultural framework. Our approach to Western science comes from our Western culture. Our approach to Eastern science comes from Eastern cultures. And of course, Indigenous science, we also have to be careful not to treat that as a monolith either, because there's a multiverse of Indigenous knowledge systems and a multiverse of Indigenous approaches to that. So I think in what I would say in setting the tone for today is that luckily we are in Hawaii. And so today we are going to take a very Hawaii kanaka o iwi, perhaps local, and Indigenous, that's Hawaii based in a Hawaii framework. But we should always remember when we're talking that we shouldn't treat these cultures as monolithic, these knowledge systems. So yeah, that's just my mana'o for today. And I hope that we can walk in that and kind of talk about and thinking about, weaving. I think the idea of where we want to go, is synergy. I think that's the goal, is to say that how can we take the best of both? How can we leverage from an Indigenous framework of approach to science and then utilize and bring to bear, contemporary technologies? But that's how we should, we should be more careful, I think, of how we kind of frame that, so that we are elevating to equivalent levels, so that we aren't dismissing and kind of erasing. And I just wanted to bring in one piece that really gave me hope yesterday, which is that the United States White House Office of Science, Technology, and Policy just released a landmark memoranda that they released a memoranda that commits to elevating Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge in federal scientific and policy processes. And what is so amazing is that it's recognizing and elevating it to equal levels. And I think that embracing Indigenous knowledge, the US federal government has never done that. And I think this really kind of sets the stage for the University of Hawaii also to do the same. So mahalo.
Thank you so much for taking the time to help us understand that better. I think that for those who don't sometimes think about the words that they're using or the semantics of it and what is perhaps behind the words that they're using, they can often use them in ways that imply things they didn't mean to. So really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through this. I'm wondering, Sharon, if you wouldn't mind speaking about what you are currently most excited about in your work to address these grand challenges. I know that the challenges that Kapua outlined and that Mehana outlined, both from, they spoke to the scientific aspects, they also spoke to the community aspects and the challenges that we face in education, where you've spent so much of your career in making huge changes in our system. And I wonder if you can just speak to what you're currently most excited about in your work to address these challenges.
When we were discussing this panel, so thank you for that question and for all the mana'o that people have offered here. I think when we were talking about this panel that we were talking about, Melissa, you were talking about, well, there are people at the beginning of their career and people towards the end. And I was like, oh, she's pointing at me. That's what this is about. And I have to say that I'm excited about the same things, many of the same things that I was 30 years ago. I've seen change, and what I do within our Pacific internship programs of Exploring Science, for Exploring Science, PIPES has become a network of people that I've worked with, starting with summer internships in 1994 out in the Pacific. And that for 28 summers, I have worked with different groups, and that still is my hope. When I see that what I'm excited about is every group, every summer, talking with them. It's been really challenging the last couple years as we've done some remote and trying to do really continuing that engagement. I think when we go to the grand challenges that Kapua and Mehana were talking about, that's our place. This is the state of our place, and what I get very excited about, and yet I see we have a lot of work to do, is really engaging our next generation of island students who are able to bring what Rosie's talking about, this foundational knowledge, this generational knowledge, and bringing that so that when they come in a door in Chris's lab, that they can bring that, and that's an asset They are established there. They are bringing something to the table. And similarly within the community work, that's where I've had the opportunity and these many years of seeing now those people who are provided the opportunity to bring that knowledge in the door as students and then as professionals. Now things are shifting, and that's the really exciting part too, where we have leadership of people who are walking in this space and are able to bring who they are. There was a term, collaborative interconnectedness. So to Rosie's point of blending, it's really bringing these connections and networks into the work that we do here with our island resources, and importantly with our community, because I think that's the other element here in this thread that's implied by all of us, is that people are disconnected often from resources and disconnected from each other, and that has only been highlighted by this pandemic. And how do we bring people together? Because I think they really, there is a strong desire to be connected, and the university has a real role by really carrying that connection to place, connection to community into all of the work we do, the education and research, and how are we working as a part of communities to do that. So I'm really excited. I think there's some fantastic things that are coming out and conversations that are being had right now too, that are really bringing different knowledge systems together, different connections in different places and communities. And UH has a real role within that.
Mahalo. I've been reminded by my Indigenous colleagues that we bring our ancestors with us when we come into a space. And so, in fact, some have recommended that I should be asking potential students who are wanting to join my lab to be chanting their genealogies, so I understand the history and what they are bringing into the space with them as they come to work into my lab. But I think one of the things you're alluding to that's so important is that we have people whose roots go very, very deep in these islands, and they have that connection to place that forms a foundation in a different way for the work that they do. Those of us whose ancestors are not buried in the islands still love this place, and we can work for this place together with others. But coming together, recognizing those histories and the knowledge that's brought both ancestrally, as well as the knowledge that culture is living, it's emerging, and Hawaiian ways of knowing and all ways of knowing are constantly evolving over time. And so I really appreciate the work in education that you do to bring people into these spaces. Christopher, I'm wondering if you can speak to what you are most excited about in your work to address these challenges. I know that in the video we saw quite a bit of the work that you're doing, the challenges that you know that we're facing. What are you most excited about as you think about the work that you're doing to solve these problems?
Thank you for that question. So I wanted to kind of pull together a lot of what we've heard in this panel already. And one of the things that we've discovered as we progress in our understanding of the environment and global change issues is that everything is connected. You know, the indigenous Hawaiians completely understood this, and they were one with their environment. We've moved away from that, and you know, we don't really appreciate that the land, the ocean, the atmosphere, the people are all part of an integral system that are all working together. And you mentioned at the beginning of this idea that you can feel overwhelmed sometimes by all the changes that we're experiencing. What do you do about it? And I think once you understand that we are all a part of this one system that's all working together, you can either be working against that and be a part of continuing the problem, or you can be a part of the solution. And I think what I'm most excited about are all of the people, the students, the community, other scientists that are all starting to really work together to try and address some of these problems. You know, we've had challenges in the past with those that don't appreciate or acknowledge the impact that humans have had on our environment. And I think that's changing, that we're seeing a revolution here in our understanding and appreciation of the role that humans play in our global environment. And I'm really excited to see where we take this and incorporating traditional knowledge, the new science that we're developing, and pulling it all together as a community to improve the world that we live in.
Wonderful. Rosie, when you retire, what would success look like?
Okay, so success for me would be when the demographic of the professoriate looks like the demographic of Hawaii. I think it's crucially important that we create the space for Native Hawaiians, for local students to be able to come in, feel comfortable, and occupy these spaces, not actually just at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa, in DAR, in NOAA, in all of these spaces, for those of us who do have these intergenerational connections to the land, to be making these decisions. I think it's critically important. I think that, you know, there is often a mindset of we have to look elsewhere. Even the word mainland, we should be normalizing the word continental, you know, because this is our mainland. Hawaii is our mainland. And so I would say, if I look back and I was being replaced by another Hawaiian, if I was being replaced by another local person, if I could go to meetings and hearings and, you know, see from the top down that we had local people who were trained, who didn't have to leave to get that training to be here, that would be success to me. I feel like I could retire happy. So I really look at the pathways and systems for making that happen. I look at how can we change our mindset around, and maybe even having to change our educational systems around, you know, this idea that people have to go away in order to study to come back. Now, there's nothing wrong with having different experiences, but perhaps this idea that there's something, you know, less, I think that's also false. You know, the University of Hawaii has an amazing educational system. That's why we're all here, to transform it and make it better. So I would say, to me, when I retired, that would be like, you know, the pièce de résistance.
Wonderful. So Kapua, you, the rest of our panelists are working from the university side. You are a collaborator with the university working on the landscape. Sometimes as university professors, we forget that our job is to provide good information, but the people doing the real on the ground work and change are people like you. What are you looking to the university for in regards to the major gaps that need to be addressed in the next 25 years? What kinds of solutions are you hoping that the university can help provide for people who are working on the ground like you are?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to tie into what Sharon mentioned about her amazing work in that 30 years. You should be proud. She's built and you know, mentored so many leaders in the community and has had an exponential effect through that training of those leaders who have then trained others. I would say the same with Rosie's comment that UH is uniquely positioned for to be a training ground for local folks. And I think as far as the success with capacity building to support, you know, our needs for natural resource managers in our program, I did the numbers crunching yesterday, and half of the people that work for our program, we have 52 people that work in our program. So 25, not quite half, have had some affiliation with UH, have gotten an undergraduate degree, an advanced degree, UH Hilo. So some part of the university system has affected their direction, and they've ended up where they are. So I think that's really, really hopeful. What was it? Question again? Oh, and then also research. I think the, you know, contributions that UH has made through the years. I mean, we've been in partnership with UH for 20 years now, and we've had research, you know, partnerships in all the different departments: zoology, NREM, botany, geography, yeah, pretty much all the different facets of the work we do have been furthered by, you know, techniques development, methods development, understanding the biology of the species that we work with better, and just, yeah, generally assisting in furthering our understanding of the natural resources in Hawaii. So I think UH has played a very important role, and I just hope that that continues. And I think with the partnership that was highlighted with the new NREM extension professor, Dr. Clay Trowernick, I think that's another opportunity for that to even expand further, and Clay to transfer, like he said, that information from the university into on the ground, you know, knowledge that we can take and work with to further our protection of resources, Mauka. So
Thank you.
Mahalo for that question.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. As I listen across the panelists today, and as I talk with other people across our islands, what I hear so often is that, yes, there are research and natural sciences, technological challenges that need to be solved. And the university has a very important role to play in that. But so often it is the social aspects, the education aspects, the political aspects that actually need a lot of attention to be able to move forward on these things. In a lot of cases, we actually know the solutions we need to implement. We just don't have the funding, the political will, the social acceptance of moving forward on some of the actions that we need to take. And so I want to turn to Mehana, because I think that your work is so important in the social sciences in helping us to actually move forward and thinking about how we work with communities to address these challenges, because individual people working as Kapua does, you know, in the mountains or in our marine systems, can't solve things alone. We need communities working with us to solve these problems. And so, Mehana, you started around the same time as Rosie at the university. When you retire, what would success look like?
For me, success would look like every Ahupua'a, every single Ahupua'a in Hawaii has a community group caring for land there and caring for resources and able to make decisions about those resources in a way that sustains the resources and the people. And we have this idea of kipuka when lava goes around a stand of native forest, and we think of that kipuka as being isolated. But because it's just surrounded by black rock everywhere. But what that kipuka actually is a source, right? That's the seed bank to restore the rest of that landscape. And it has that idea of spreading. And that's what I see. I see community groups across the archipelago. Maybe in the 80s, there was a handful, and in the 90s more. But if you look from 2000 to 2010 and 2010 to 2020, the groups that have sprung up to step forward and support state agencies that are understaffed in taking care of the places that they love and define them is amazing. And that's because of organizations like Āina, Ulu Awamo, Kua, and others. And I think it's a restoration of sovereignty in the face of the historic injustice that we face in Hawaii, because it's a restoration of people's connection to land and their responsibility to be the caretakers and decision makers. And it's amazing at the university because these are great learning environments for our students. Our students go out into these community groups and they learn so much. So I think that movement is vital. And I think Kapua and her organization are part of it. As Hawaiians, we have to care for every part of Hawaii. That's our kuleana. Individual ohana have kuleana across generations for different places. But we cannot say those are army lands. Those have nothing to do with us. That is not, and I love the university. I think the university is vital in all of this because it's a place to bring together paradox and contradiction and to talk about those tough things. So right now, those military lands of Oahu are some of the best cared for ecologically in all of Hawaii, even as they are bombed as training grounds. That's an amazing paradox. That's a difficult thing we have to talk about. And at the same time, it's something that provides this great training grounds because those places are cared for. And so how do we get that kind of work on those federal lands onto our state lands? How do we get that kind of funding? So I think one thing that's an area of hope with this spreading is taking these bright spots and thinking about how do we elevate places that are struggling, and how do we spread what's happening in these bright spots, and learn from them and elevate all of our places in Hawaii and all of our communities, to be able to really care for resources sustainably over the long term in the ways they know how and know are needed.
So I want to note that people have been putting questions into the Q&A area, and I want to address some of those, although I will also note that if you want to put your questions into the Q&A, our panelists are actually as well answering them live in the chat. And so just want to know that note that those are some options for you to ask questions of the panelists. And so I would invite you to continue putting questions into the Q&A. So one question here is, what tangible steps are being taken in your work to address and begin to reverse climate change, the call of our times? I'm wondering if, Christopher, you might speak to this. I know you started answering it in the chat, but for folks who maybe aren't able to read it, maybe they're driving in their car on the way to work and listening along, would you mind verbally answering that out loud as well?
Sure. I just typed the answer in. So I find that, like I said in my response, that knowledge is power. And I think sharing an understanding of not only what do we understand about our environment and the pressures that are being exerted on it, but also what don't we understand, and where are areas where we need more help to better understand what's happening is a useful construct to use. And there was a part of that question was asking, how do I instill hope in the younger generations? I actually find it's the opposite of that, when I am teaching, I teach a global environmental change class, and it can be a bit of a depressing class at times, but I actually get a lot of hope from the younger generations that I'm teaching in appreciating their enthusiasm and their commitment to the environment and their willingness to do what it takes to do the right thing and help the world. And so I just try and guide that in a positive direction and try and help to again share what I know, but also to encourage them to help us understand what we don't know and where we still have open questions that can perhaps help us to better understand how to fix this problem that we're facing.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the things, as you have the opportunity to listen to folks who are working on the front lines, the more you realize there are no easy answers. So people always want silver bullets. They want to know, come on, there's got to be something we can do that's pretty easy and that no one's thought of yet. And I think the more you talk with folks on the front lines, you realize that there are no easy answers. All of the easy problems were solved before we got here, and we've got the hard problems left. As I tell my students, it's job security. So this is as the person put in that question, the challenges of our time are ones that there are no easy answers for. So that brings us to a question in the chat regarding as recently as in the early 1900s, Native Hawaiians fished in canoes. Today, marine transportation uses fossil fuel powered boats, helicopters, and airplanes. They have a solution they're thinking that the university could potentially help with. Might the Department of Engineering or another college innovatively work on alternative sources of power for these modes of transportation? So I'm wondering, I know no one that's on our panel today works with engineering directly, but is there someone on the panel who would like to address that question? I see, Rosie, that you're typing an answer. Did you want to address it verbally?
Well, so what I was going to say is that we do have people who are we're working on that, not directly us at this moment. So the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute, which is housed within the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology, is a unit that is very much looking into alternative fuel sources. I think that there are, and now I'm speaking with my hat of being the vice chair of the Honolulu Climate Change Commission. We as policymakers are also very much looking into how to reutilize fuel sources and how to restructure some of our processes. I guess I just should to reconnect that to the question that Chris just answered is, policy is really what is most powerful here in this question of climate change. But of course, policy begins with research, and so I think that there are a lot of really excellent research going on here at the University of Hawaii to answer it. But I think a caution to this that I want to add is that in the process of us developing these alternative energies, we cannot lay the burden and be regressive and lay the negative impacts on our local communities. So I'm thinking very much about the tensions around, environmental justice, and thinking about, say, for example, what's going on in Kahuku with the wind turbines. And then also, when we think of geothermal and its impact on Pelehonua Mea, these are very important questions that we can't just brush under the rug. And in our fight to move forward and get off of fossil fuels, we cannot make ourselves dependent on other kinds of industries and energies that are equally or maybe even more negative in terms of its impacts and pollution. So I think it's really cautionary. And I think that a lot of that is also tied into our Western society, which is very consumption oriented.
Sharon, I want to direct a question at you. When I attended the Hawaii Conservation Conference for the first time, one of the things that struck me is that the attendance of our local community was so high. When I attend many conservation conferences around the world, they tend to be, for lack of a better term, very white dominated. And locally, we've done an amazing job at bringing everybody in the room together to solve problems. And I attribute that hugely in part to the work that you've done over time. There's a question in the chat, and I know that Rosie has directly answered it in the chat and had spoken to this before, but I'm wondering if you can speak to it from the perspective of the PIPES program and other programs where you've really brought people, again, whose ancestry is tied to these lands into these spaces. And so the comment in the chat was, Rosie's analysis is profound. Would she agree that perhaps overly simplistic? The issue is that Western science is a knowledge system in a reductional intellectual way, whereas indigenous cultural ways of understanding is wisdom, a holistic combination of intellect, emotion, physical, and spiritual. And again, I know Rosie answered this in the chat, but I'm wondering, Sharon, if you can speak to this from your work in bringing multiple communities into the room together.
Oh, that's a big question, Melissa.
I know. Thank you.
And I am a learner in this space. I'm in all spaces. I try to be a learner. I think to speak to what others are sharing, it is about process. My partner always laughs like, oh, it's always a process. It always comes down to process, right? And it is how we're working together, how we are coming together. When I started PIPES, and I am often speak to this, is that the representation in our leadership and in our conservation community is not reflective of our local communities. Why is that? And in talking with both groups, it was like, well, I need a paid opportunity, and this is in 1994, and the organizations were like, we don't have a way to recruit. We don't do that. It was an easy solution. It's like, let's bring these together. In the Pacific Islands, it was even more powerful. It was like, our students are either not coming back, or they're coming back not prepared with knowledge that is connected to this place and our issues. So how do we pull those together? And I think that's what PIPES has been able to do with partners, though, when you say, you've done all this, it's been such a space in which we've had organizations willing to work with local students, and importantly, with the ideas that they bring in the door. And Pipes started as simply as a summer internship program, and it's developed very much into and developing constantly into a space where people can learn about what their role, how do they bring their role and their kuleana into a career and that knowledge back to their community. And that's what these students are wanting. And UH is a really important player within the conservation communities. When we look at the Hawaii Conservation Alliance that pulls that conservation conference together, it is very firmly walking into the world of this biocultural knowledge and how are we bringing these systems, these knowledge systems together. So is it wisdom, as Rosie wrote, it's actually a life way. How do we really bring how we are as a people here in Hawaii and in the Pacific Islands who are born of resiliency? You know, it is, islands have the technology and then the ancestral knowledge to be resilient, or else we wouldn't be here. And how do we take people who are born of that, those generations, and with that knowledge, how do we bring that to the table such that we're working now on solutions going forward, informed from our past? And that's been fascinating to watch as people who have graduated from programs here at UH and at other places, and bringing that back to their communities has been very valuable. And I think that that's where UH can really look to how are we engaging our students, and importantly, our along with it is our faculty and our resources to these questions at hand. It's not about UH working in isolation, it's working like the places like Āina, where it is how are we bringing these ideas together and these communities together, and communities have an equal seat at the table. That's where I've been really blessed to work with a lot of the people who are now sitting at the table, and really leading those conversations. The conversations are shifting, but they're also the same. It's how are we connecting together? And that's been a wonderful thing. Like I said, that brings me joy when I see these people, the alumni and programs, graduates of other programs, et cetera, who have really been able to and empowered to now bring those ideas to the table for solutions. I don't know if that answered your question. I'm just really excited about where we are now and our potential for the future too.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. So Rosie had put a question into the chat for the audience. And so I would invite you, if you have not yet gotten onto the Q&A and would like to contribute either a question or a comment, we have a question for you. And so the question for you is, how would our approach to natural resource management in Hawaii be different if we had locally trained expertise, people who were raised in these communities in which they're working, local experts who had the historical and personal connections to these landscapes and seascapes? So we invite you to put those answers into the Q&A, into the chat. And we have another question that's come in here. Can you talk more about the Ahupua'a system and the speaker's work and connections to this topic? So let's see here. I know I kind of started off with framing this the way I think about it. I think the way the water runs. And so I think Mauka to Makai, but I've had other folks who corrected me on that, and they think very much about the oceans moving up to the mountains. But the Ahupua'a work, maybe, or Ahupua'a system, is there one of our panelists who would like to take that question?
I can try. I would say that the Ahupua'a system continues to inspire us and teach us all. It was part of a whole nested system of resource management and boundaries, momoku, all of these smaller ili, and what we're learning. And it continues to be a model for sustainability through the research of faculty at Mānoa, and increasingly our students who are at the front lines of this. We're learning more and more about the diversity of Ahupua'a systems. And we're learning that some of the myths we've held dear are not true. They don't always follow watersheds. They don't always run mountain to sea. But what they all do is they are very place adapted ways of tying community to ecosystem and working towards the sustainability of both. And that is done in ingenious ways we couldn't ever have imagined as our students are researching and learning. One example is on my island, we're finding out the moku boundaries, districts, and Ahupua'a boundaries shifted all the time. And this was true for different places. There are places where an Ahupua'a boundary goes out into the ocean and then zigzags to get some coral reef, because that particular Ahupua'a didn't have any coral reef in it. So there's no other reason that it would, do this strange bend. We're learning through our students about processes of managing soil in very different forms of Ahupua'a and replenishing soil and nutrients. We're learning about the diversity of crops that were adapted to different ecosystems and the huge range of styles of fish ponds, right, for different Ahupua'a, and how those were managed and how those can be managed in the face of climate change as the ocean is coming. So the Ahupua'a research into Ahupua'a systems is very vibrant at UH. And I think it could never be more exciting in terms of guiding our adaptation to climate change and our thoughts about what sustainability means in Hawaii. So we're just excited, and students, the work they're doing is so incredible.
Wonderful. Christopher, I see you're about to speak.
Well, I was just going to say that on the marine side, as a marine chemist, someone that studies the chemistry of the waters, I've been really fascinated to begin studying the Hawaiʻi fish pond chemistry and how it's evolving as they're reconstructing the pond and the walls, and the connections between what comes from the land and what comes from the ocean, and how it all integrates together to make a healthy fish pond system. And so, for example, one of the, and how we can understand the traditional knowledge of how those ponds were made in terms of our current scientific approaches. For example, one of the things that, as they're rebuilding the walls in Hawaiʻi, so the pond walls are lava rock on the inside and outside with crushed coral in between. So it looks kind of like an Oreo cookie from above, right? And so why were those walls built that way? Well, it looks kind of cool, but it turns out too, from an ocean chemistry standpoint, that anybody that's ever had a saltwater aquarium knows that to keep their fish alive, you have to run those waters through a crushed coral filter as they get circulated through your aquarium. And that's essentially what the design of the wall was all about, was as the waters flow through the wall in a rising tide and a falling tide, it's dissolving those crushed carbonate particles that help to neutralize the ammonia produced from the fish that are in the pond. And so this is a knowledge that wasn't necessarily passed down of why you build the wall this way. They were being rebuilt that way, I think, primarily just because that's the way it was done. But we can use our modern scientific approaches to try and understand what's the scientific basis behind that. And I think that's a really fascinating thing where we can tie and try and understand the understanding that these traditional people had as they again worked with the environment to create a balanced system. And it seems that so much of what we're doing today with our human activity is unbalancing the system. We need to get back to rebalancing it.
Yeah, great points. Sharon, I see that you indicated you'd like to answer the question here from Puanani. So I'll just read the question out so the rest of the audience can see it. I really don't think we will ever find a solution until we stop dichotomizing Western science versus culture. Science is native to all cultures. As Hawaiians, we need to stop seeing science and culture as separate. Western science, as it is now, is meant to be used across all cultures. I see it as global science. This has limits, and that is where culture comes in as the local manifestation to what we all see the same way. There's common ground among all cultures in how we see nature. This is our hope. Sharon.
Yeah, thank you. In growing on what the others have said, I think there are real opportunities here that with a changing climate, well, the climate has always been changing, and as we adapt to these changes that are happening now, we have a lot of resources that is from these systems, like Chris is talking about with the local IA and the people who are actively managing. And I think often we talk about Hawaii as a great example in which we people often think of ancestral knowledge and they think it is something in the past that we just we're not utilizing. And I think the reality is it's very active. It's being practiced today. And like all practitioners, we are constantly adapting. An example over at on the west side of Hawaii, where, boy, and I'm just blanking on the project, Pu'uwawa, excuse me, at Pu'uwawa, of where we're having people come together and they're looking at this pu'u that was a very important area. And it was important in part because of the food it produced and the importance that food landscape had for communities. And so when we are looking at science, that idea of what was there, what grows well there today, and how do we feed people from that place, that incorporates all aspects of science. I fully agree that I think sometimes in different groups, and even for this panel, we were talking about that term Western science. It's like, it always like, it's just not a really good term. Rosie talked about Eastern science and Western science, Indigenous science. How are we working together with this knowledge? At Pu'uwawa, it's pulling community together and researchers together and students together, people who have genealogical ties to that area, and people who have abilities to look from a satellite, to look at the data from a satellite to see how the clouds are changing and moving. And how do we pull all of that knowledge together? Yeah, we all need to work together. And I think there are great examples in which the university has joined in that space to bring science to the biggest, is sometimes how Western science is talked about, and science that we all do, and how are we working together to, importantly, I think all of this is related to how do we thrive as a community, and that means not only restoring and preserving. It is not about preservation, it's about thriving into the future. And to do that, we're going to have to combine. We're going to need to bring together these different ways of knowing and allow that to feed our process going forward. So I just wanted to give a shout out to all of the folks over at Pu'uwawa who are really focusing on similar examples. And I have to call out Hawaii Island here a little bit too. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Melissa,
yeah, go ahead.
Can I just tie into that Ahupua'a, or just contribute
Please.
one more thing to that discussion? I think that that Hawaiians are keen observers, and I think that and their practices center around that ability to and that intimate knowledge of the different parts of the Ahupua'a, right? So there were practitioners for different pieces of what went on in the Ahupua'a, and I think that similarly, there's scientists that are, studying those different pieces of our Ahupua'a and the layout of the system. But bringing those together is really critical. I just want to give an example of my dad, who's been swimming every reef in Kaneohe Bay for decades. And he was swimming one reef and he said, "Yeah, I never seen this coral before." And it turns out he found a patch of 3 invasive corals And he told my sister about it, of course, and then Dara got involved and it got removed. But I think just the keen observation skills of Hawaiians, no matter what generation, is such an important part in being kilo for our resources and what's happening with them. And I think we need to engage every possible person in our community in helping us through the challenges of climate change into the future. So that's just my mana'o. Mahalo.
Thank you so much. There are questions coming fast and furious now into the chat, and we've got about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to maybe combine a couple of these questions. There's a few questions in the line of thinking about the role of the university. So I'm gonna maybe read off these couple, and then if the panelists can choose how you'd like to address these. What are the strengths and areas for growth that you see necessary to educate students to be competitive with imports from continental universities? And there's a similar question here in regards to many on this call are deeply engaged in the management, history, and engineering of fish ponds and other sustainable programs. How might we systematically engage university research teams with us as we work to develop sustainable programs? And then there's a similar question along the lines of well-paid conservation work. How can we develop those jobs that allow our children to stay home and do a Malama Āina oriented work? So I'll throw those three kind of, in my mind, related questions out to the panelists and let you hop in as you wish.
I'd like to hop in and try and address the strength and areas for growth that we see to educate students to be competitive. So I think that we already have some very strong programs. I don't mean to like ring our own bell, but the Global Environmental Science program at the University of Hawaii is really, really outstanding for cultivating and growing future environmental scientists who have gone on, who continue to go on and work, go to graduate school. The strengths that I see actually are that they are one of the biggest strengths, I would say, of this program. And so maybe this can be something that I see is that they have a capstone or thesis project. And this capstone or thesis project requires them to do research that is interesting to them, oftentimes that engage, questions that our communities want to know the answers to. And I think that that's vitally important. So to go through that exercise, that very real world exercise of problem solving, of bringing to bear evidence-based methodologies with their local points of view is incredibly powerful. So I see that as a strength that we should lean on and continue to grow, is how do we get our students to problem solve the problems that our communities are facing? The areas for growth that I see that are necessary to compete with import, I think that one thing that we're not doing, is that we're not addressing really important issues of Indigenous data sovereignty. And I know that's going to sound like it comes out of left field, but in fact it doesn't. And the reason is because in our points of view, this data that we're producing, our students are collecting geological data, they're collecting chemical data, they're collecting language data, they're collecting, chemical data, genomic data. In a Kanaka Oiwi-centered point of view, all of this data is actually our relations, because we have familial relationships with all of this data. And I think that a weakness that we can build upon at the University of Hawaii, if there's anything you want to walk away from, it's that we need to build data management systems that serve our communities. And I'm going to try and thread the needle here, because what I'm not saying is that UH should be the seat of intellectual property. And I know that's going to sound scary, and I'm probably going to get dragged for it. This knowledge has to be seated in communities. The knowledge has to be seated in, and so we have, what I think would make us even stronger is if we figure out a way to empower our communities to have the agency to hold this information that they can then utilize, and that our students can then come to these places and learn from these spaces. So I would actually advocate for more in community place-based learning as an area for growth, because Hawaii has such diverse ecosystems that you could actually probably utilize almost any community to solve almost any terrible problem on earth. You need to figure out how to manage waste. We have a huge waste problem. You want to figure out how to grow plants out of nothing. Go to Kaho'olawe where they have no topsoil. You can come up with a place in Hawaii that likely has a problem that you can solve. And so I really do think that Hawaii, being a microcosm of the environments that we see around the world, that's our strength. So rather than looking outward, I think we have to focus on what we are good at and what is unique about us.
There's a great comment in the chat and responding to Rosie's question earlier, and so I want to share that. This is from Aaron Fitch. I grew up on the continent and received my PhD in earth sciences at UH. I found myself turning to the professors or other graduate students that I knew had grown up in Hawaii to understand their experience of climate change over their lives. As a scientist, I can look at temperatures and precipitation records, but I needed to talk to the Kanaka scientists to understand how that data translated to crops, flooding, coastal changes, hurricane effects, and the everyday experience of living in Hawaii. This is the experience of the local community and local family histories, and Kanaka scientists can help better serve these people because they understand decadal changes from their personal experience. So that maybe leads nicely into Katie's question, which I think actually was in part answered by Rosie a moment ago. And I'm just going to read the end here. I've seen many Native practitioners want to protect their places. They don't always want to share where certain resources are or where certain culturally significant places are for good reasons. Any suggestions for how to balance sharing and protecting knowledge? Is there someone who wants to take on that question?
I think that the university's made key strides in this way. Rosie's been a leader in this, but I think the key is how the knowledge will be used. Increasingly, it's so wonderful to be working with students who come from communities who have projects they need to do. They're there kuleana to go back and care for their community. Or we just do community engaged research. We work only on problems and topics that are real on the ground needs that communities are bringing to us. And there was a question about how there can be more of that sort of research. But if you're not gathering knowledge and then taking it away from a community and extracting it, if you're working with a community on the questions they have to gather information in the ways that they want to, and then they get to manage that information and apply it to solve problems in their own ways going forward, then you get away from these issues. And also communities craft what they want to share and how. You can have many levels of sharing, right? And in any project we have public products, things that go for the NSF funded grant. And then we have things that are just for communities or just for families or just for the individual you interviewed. So there are many levels of sharing. I just wanted to tackle, Ken Kaneshiro asked about the Ahupua'a and remembering it's a system, and someone asked about our university as an Ahupua'a. And I think that's so true to what Kapua said. There's experts in all areas, right? There's departments that specialize in different things. We need them all, but what the Ahupua'a has is interface between all of these systems and sharing of ideas and connecting, because I would define science as careful observation and experimentation over time and building on that knowledge of others and handing it down and adding to it. And I think that's what the Ahupua'a did, is bring people looking at different parts of the system in a sustained way together to think about konohiki, how do we enable everyone to manage better together? And part of that is the water, right? Making sure there's enough water for everything and everyone. And I think those are two areas the university can improve. One is more learning from the environment itself, more out of classroom time, more learning from our practitioners that are out on the ground versus us faculty in classrooms. These online environments are wonderful, but we found in COVID how nourishing the on the ground environments are and how much our students need them. And then secondly, thinking about the water sources and the funding, and is that equitable across an Ahupua'a to sustain actual life? A program like Sharon's that has been so successful and run for decades and lifetime for many of us should not have to write grants every year in the university system. It should just be an established part of what is funded because it matters. And I think getting to Kevin Chang's question, this is where the university needs to change, is we're always looking for the new thing, the latest research, and that's sort of the model of academia, but we need to be looking at what are on the ground needs, what are the on the ground needs, who is meeting them, and how do we fund that in a sustainable way, and places that are not funded at all versus places that are funded very wealthfully. How do we start to move funding more equitably to those places so that everybody is supported? Which gets into your question, Kevin. I think that's part of our university helping to inform our Hawaiʻi about funding what's important, which is not any longer jobs in tourism that barely pay and require us to bring more and more and more people. It's jobs caring for our environment, which really is our economy, is our strength and our sustainability. And our young people need to get sustainable jobs where they can feed their families doing this vital, vital work that in turn teaches our students.
Mehana, you did a beautiful job of, I think, addressing many of the questions that had not yet been addressed. My apologies that we won't make it to all of the questions and comments in the Q&A today as we are out of time, but I want to offer a huge mahalo to all of our panelists today, both for the wisdom that you shared with us during the panel, but also for the deep work and important work that you do every day across the islands, both to generate and collate knowledge that will make the world a better place for the next generations, and for the on-the-ground work that you do, particularly Kapua with your organization in making our islands more sustainable into the future. So thank you again to all of our panelists. Thank you to those who attended today and provided both your comments and questions. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the host.